I'm just going to preempt what Seth is going to say because I saw the vice president yesterday saying that all the promises that the Trump administration made about bringing jobs back and manufacturing and how that was going to help wages go up. He said none of that happened, and that he was going to make sure that we delivered on these promises this time. I went back and just thought in my own mind before the pandemic, I think those were pretty good employment numbers we saw. Unemployment was very low. It helped a lot of groups that hadn't participated recently. We had some of the fastest wage growth that we've seen in a decade, and we had some pretty good stock market action. So did any of that come from the tax cuts and from the what we saw in the first part of the Trump administration, or was that all goes back to Obama and Vice President Biden and President Obama and Vice President Biden and their policies?
Well, look, I mean, certainly the economy had been growing, and then you had the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, enacted at the end of 2017. And what I can tell you is, and we've looked at the data, what we saw in response, comparing the 8 quarters before the TCJA to the 8 quarters after, we saw a significant increase in capital expenditures, investment by companies, a significant drop in net debt issuance, so companies were deleveraging. And you saw a significant increase in research and development expenses, all of which will then ultimately create, more innovation, more jobs, kind of continue to fuel the knowledge economy that is the future of the United States. So I think, there is a story to tell about what happened after the TCJA and the benefits that it had for the economy. Of course, that quickly gets clouded by the pandemic and the deep recession that follows.
Right. That was going to be my point, Seth, and I am not arguing with you right now, and I'm not trying to convince you of anything. But I do remember before the pandemic, there was just a thought that Democrats were going to have a hard time running against the economy that we had seen prior to the pandemic in terms of unemployment and wage gains and everything else. And just hearing the vice president say nothing was working now that the pandemic has hit, and you're able to say that because we're in dire straits at this point. But I think that's a false narrative, Seth, and I think it would have been tough to run back then against the economy.
I mean, I think, we're in the last few years of a recovery that began, 10 years ago, and I think a lot of those positive trends had continued in terms of wage growth, in terms of job growth. Job growth was slower, though, in the last couple of years than they were, during President Obama and Vice President Biden's term.
But why? I mean, you can't keep growing from when you're at 12%. It's easier to get to 5 than it is to get from 5 to 3, right? I mean, it was kind of slow.
Underlying trends that just continued. And I don't know what the promise of the tax cut, right, was that there would be such a boom in business investment that U.S. workers would become so productive that they would get a $4,000 or $9,000 raise. Business investment declined after the tax cut. And I don't know what numbers Rohit is looking at, but that was the big promise of the tax cut. And it completely didn't happen. What did happen is that corporate revenues fell off a cliff, and corporations have gotten hundreds of billions of tax cuts. Corporate revenue is down by a third. It's added to deficits. And I think what the message, even before the pandemic, is that regular workers, rank and file workers, weren't sharing in the fruits of the recovery as well as they should have. And I think those trends are long term.
It was a long term trend because income inequality got much worse during the Obama years as well because of the Fed or whatever, however you want to blame it. But when you cut business taxes, of course, revenues are going to go down. That was the whole point of doing it. You're hoping that the growth it engenders, you make up for that elsewhere. And tax revenue did not decline overall at that point. I think it was basically flat, was it not?
Well, no, revenues as a percent of GDP did decline. But that, you have a $1.5 trillion tax cut. That's certainly to be expected. Although, remember, of that $1.5 trillion,
declined how much? Declined how much, Rohit? It was because I remember. Did it decline 1%? I thought that the tax revenue was fairly flat.
Tenths of percentage of GDP, right? The way to measure revenues is against the relative size of the economy. So it wasn't like they fell off a cliff.
Right.
And nor would you have expected it, because even a $1.5 trillion tax cut, remember, that's over 10 years. In that same 10-year period, the federal government's going to spend and collect something like $43 trillion.
Rohit, did we remember that there? I can just remember that Republicans said, we heard there was no magic wand to bring back manufacturing jobs. And they said, see, we did. We were able to do that. Seth, is that a false narrative that we did find something that started bringing manufacturing jobs back here? I mean, we were on our way, weren't we?
I mean, the manufacturing sector was in a recession in all of 2019. And I just think, all of the promise about capital coming back to the United States and business investing, an investment boom, like simply didn't pan out. And this was before the pandemic.